The Spanish moss swayed like funeral shrouds in the Louisiana twilight as Marie Laveau Baptiste pressed her weathered hands against the ancient oak's bark, feeling the pulse of something older than slavery, older than the white men who claimed ownership over human souls. In her palms lay a collection of bones, herbs, and dark earth that would seal the fate of Madame Evangeline Dubois, the woman who had stolen Marie's daughter and sold her to the brothels of New Orleans. Tonight, the old gods of Africa would answer Marie's call for justice, and the elegant mistress of Belmont Plantation would learn that some curses are patient as the grave itself. If you're ready to witness one of history's most chilling tales of supernatural revenge, hit that subscribe button now. Give this video a like and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what Marie Baptiste unleashed in the Louisiana bayous will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice, magic, and the power of a mother's fury. The year was 1847, and the antebellum South had reached the peak of its grotesque prosperity, built upon the systematic brutalization of 4 million enslaved souls. In Louisiana's sugar parishes, where the humid air hung heavy with the scent of magnolia blossoms and human suffering, plantation society had evolved its own peculiar form of aristocratic cruelty, one that masked unspeakable barbarism beneath layers of French refinement and Catholic piety. Belmont Plantation sprawled across 8,000 acres of the richest alluvial soil in Louisiana, its boundaries marked by ancient cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, like the gray beards of forgotten gods. The plantation house, a masterpiece of Greek revival architecture, rose from this landscape like a white monument to human exploitation, its 24 massive columns supporting galleries where the Dubois family could survey their empire of sugar and flesh from the comfort of wicker chairs and mint juleps. Marie Laveau Baptiste, 45 years old and possessed of a beauty that slavery could neither break nor claim, stood as the most feared and respected figure among the plantation's 300 enslaved souls. Her café au lait skin spoke of Creole heritage, French, Spanish, African, and Native American blood, mingling in veins that carried the wisdom of multiple traditions. But it was her eyes that truly marked her as different, deep violet black and flecked with gold. They seemed to hold secrets that predated the arrival of Europeans in the New World. Marie had been born in the slave quarters of Belmont, daughter of a woman who possessed knowledge of the old ways, the ancient spiritual practices that had survived the Middle Passage and adapted to the plants and spirits of Louisiana. From her mother, Marie had learned to read the signs in nature, to communicate with the Eliwe and spirits who governed the invisible world, and to prepare the roots, herbs, and bones that could heal or harm depending on the intention behind their use. The Dubois family had owned Belmont for 3 generations, each adding their own refinements to both the physical plantation and the sophisticated cruelties they inflicted upon their human property. The current mistress, Madame Evangeline Dubois, was a woman of 38 whose porcelain beauty concealed a soul as black as the coffee her slaves served her each morning on bone china, inherited from her grandmother's estate in France. Evangeline had been educated in the finest convent schools of New Orleans, where she had learned to speak fluent French, play the pianoforte with concert-level skill, and recite poetry with the cultivated accent of Louisiana's Creole aristocracy. She had also learned, through the casual examples of her family and social circle, to view enslaved people as a form of livestock that happened to possess the inconvenient ability to speak and reason. The plantation house itself was a testament to the architectural possibilities that unlimited slave labor could achieve. Hand-carved mahogany staircases spiraled upward beneath crystal chandeliers imported from Paris, while Persian rugs covered floors made from cypress planks so perfectly fitted that not even Louisiana's humid climate could separate the joints. Every surface gleamed with the endless polishing performed by house slaves who understood that a single smudge could result in a whipping that would leave scars for life. But it was in the quarters behind the big house where the true nature of Belmont revealed itself. Here, in rows of crude cabins barely large enough to house a single family, 300 human beings lived in conditions that would have shamed a conscientious farmer's livestock. The cabins lacked windows, proper floors, or adequate ventilation, becoming ovens in Louisiana's brutal summers and offering no protection from the winter dampness that seeped through every crack and crevice. Marie occupied a slightly larger cabin than most, a privilege that came with her position as the plantation's primary healer and spiritual advisor. The other slaves brought her their ailments, their broken hearts, and their desperate need for hope in a world that seemed designed to crush the human spirit. They also brought her their rage, the accumulated fury of people who had been stripped of their names, their families, their very humanity, and forced to smile while their oppressors profited from their suffering. Inside Marie's cabin, dried herbs hung from the rafters like botanical constellations, each plant chosen for its spiritual as well as medicinal properties. Gris-gris bags containing personal items, dirt from significant locations, and other powerful substances lined shelves made from driftwood gathered along the Mississippi River. In the center of the room stood an altar that would have terrified any white person who understood its significance, a careful arrangement of candles, bones, stones, and African artifacts that served as a gateway between the physical and spiritual worlds. The spiritual practices that Marie had inherited and refined represented a sophisticated fusion of West African religions, Native American shamanism, and Catholic mysticism. This synthesis, known throughout Louisiana as hoodoo or rootwork, provided enslaved people with a form of power that their oppressors could neither understand nor fully suppress. Through the manipulation of spiritual forces, practitioners like Marie could influence events, protect their communities, and strike back at those who harmed them. Madame Evangeline Dubois had always been suspicious of Marie's influence among the slaves, sensing something dangerous in the way other enslaved people looked at the hoodoo woman with a mixture of respect and fear. But Evangeline's suspicions had crystallized into active hatred 6 months earlier, when she had made a discovery that would set in motion the events leading to her own destruction. The discovery had come during one of Evangeline's periodic inspections of the slave quarters, tours designed to demonstrate her authority and uncover any signs of insubordination or forbidden activities. In Marie's cabin, she had found something that violated every assumption she held about the proper relationship between master and slave, evidence that Marie was teaching other enslaved people to read and write using pages torn from religious books. Literacy among slaves was not merely discouraged in Louisiana, it was a criminal offense punishable by severe penalties for both teacher and student. The law recognized that enslaved people who could read might access dangerous ideas about human equality, natural rights, and the possibility of freedom. Books were weapons more dangerous than knives in the hands of people who were supposed to accept their bondage as divinely ordained. But Evangeline's discovery had revealed something even more threatening than simple literacy instruction. Hidden beneath Marie's floorboards were journals written in multiple languages, French, Spanish, English, and what appeared to be African scripts, containing what looked like detailed records of spiritual workings, healing remedies, and other practices that suggested a level of intellectual sophistication that challenged fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy. The confrontation that followed had been swift and brutal. Evangeline had ordered Marie's 15-year-old daughter, Celeste, to be sold immediately to a New Orleans brothel as punishment for her mother's transgressions. The girl, whose beauty had inherited the best features of Marie's mixed heritage, would spend her remaining years serving the sexual appetites of white men who viewed enslaved women as objects existing solely for their pleasure. Marie had begged, had offered to take any punishment upon herself, had prostrated herself before a woman whose moral authority she had never recognized, but whose legal power over her family was absolute. But Evangeline had been unmoved by pleas that she viewed as simply another form of property damage, a slave expressing distress at the loss of valuable offspring. "You forgot your place, Marie," Evangeline had said with the casual cruelty that marked her class. "Perhaps watching your daughter's fate will remind you that everything you are, everything you love, belongs to me. I can dispose of it as I see fit." The sale had been arranged within days, conducted with the same businesslike efficiency that characterized all plantation transactions. Celeste had been loaded onto a riverboat bound for New Orleans, her tears dismissed as the natural distress of livestock being transported to new accommodations. Marie had watched from the levee as the boat carried her daughter toward a fate worse than death, her heart breaking with a pain so profound it seemed to crack the very foundations of the world. But pain, Marie had learned from her mother and grandmother, could be transformed into power. Grief could become a weapon more dangerous than any knife or gun. Love itself, when twisted by injustice and sharpened by knowledge of the spiritual world, could become an instrument of divine retribution. That night, 6 months ago, Marie had begun the slow, careful process of crafting a curse that would make Evangeline Dubois pay for her cruelty in ways that no court of law could ever achieve. Using knowledge passed down through generations of African priestesses, Native American medicine women, and Creole practitioners, she had woven together a spiritual working designed to destroy her oppressor from within. The curse would not be quick or merciful. Justice, Marie believed, required that Evangeline experience the same slow dissolution of everything that gave life meaning that she had inflicted upon enslaved families. The white woman would lose her sanity by degrees, watching her own mind crumble like sugar left too long in Louisiana's humid air. As Marie stood beneath the ancient oak tree on this humid evening in 1847, she held in her hands the final components needed to complete her working. The bones were from a black cat, killed during the dark of the moon. The herbs were gathered from a graveyard at midnight, and the soil was from the crossroads where the old African gods were said to meet to decide the fates of mortals. The Spanish moss whispered overhead like the voices of ancestors calling for justice, while somewhere in the darkness, a screech owl cried its haunting call, a sound that Marie's people knew as the herald of approaching death. Tonight, the old gods would answer her prayers, and Madame Evangeline Dubois would begin her journey into the madness that awaited all those who presumed to own human souls. In the distance, lights blazed in the windows of the plantation house, where Evangeline sat at her mahogany secretary, writing letters to friends in New Orleans, completely unaware that her fate was being sealed beneath the ancient oak where her grandfather had once hanged a slave for the crime of learning to read. The irony was perfect, Marie thought, as she began the ritual that would transform her grief into her enemy's destruction. The night was young, the spirits were listening, and justice, long delayed but never forgotten, was finally coming to Belmont Plantation. The memories flowed through Marie's consciousness like dark water through the Louisiana bayous, each one carrying the sediment of pain and wisdom that had shaped her into the woman now capable of wielding forces that could break minds and shatter souls. As she arranged the ritual components beneath the ancient oak, her thoughts drifted back to the moment when her destiny as a Hoodoo priestess had been sealed in blood and sorrow, the night her grandmother, Mama Brigitte, had passed the sacred knowledge to her granddaughter's trembling hands. Marie had been born in 1802 in the same cabin where she now lived during one of Louisiana's most violent hurricanes. Her mother, Celeste, for whom Marie's own daughter had been named, had labored through the storm while winds howled like the voices of angry ancestors, and rain lashed the quarters with the fury of divine judgment. Mama Brigitte, already ancient at 75, had delivered the baby while lightning illuminated the cabin with an otherworldly glow that seemed to mark the child as chosen by forces beyond human understanding. From her earliest memories, Marie had been aware that she was different from other enslaved children. While they played games in the dust between the quarters, she could see things that others missed, shadows that moved independently of their sources, lights that danced around certain people like halos of spiritual energy, and the translucent figures of the dead who walked among the living with messages from the other side. Her grandmother had recognized these gifts immediately and begun Marie's education in the mysteries that white people dismissed as superstition, but which represented one of humanity's oldest and most sophisticated spiritual traditions. Mama Brigitte had been born in Saint-Domingue, the island that would later become Haiti, where the synthesis of African spiritual practices with Native American traditions and Catholic mysticism had created the most powerful magical system the New World had ever known. She had witnessed the Great Revolution that had transformed enslaved Africans into the rulers of their own destiny, had seen Toussaint Louverture call upon the LWA to drive out the French colonists, and had participated in ceremonies where the spirits of Africa had possessed their descendants and given them the strength to break their chains. But Mama Brigitte had also witnessed the terrible price that such power demanded. The revolution had succeeded, but it had cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, including her own husband and 3 of her 5 children. When the violence finally ended, and Haiti emerged as the first free black republic in the Western Hemisphere, she had been among those who chose exile rather than remain in a land soaked with so much blood that even the spirits seemed traumatized by what they had witnessed. Power without wisdom is destruction, Mama Brigitte had taught young Marie during their midnight lessons in the cabin that would later become the girls' inheritance. The LWA give us strength to survive, to heal, to protect our people, but they also give us the ability to destroy our enemies. The choice between creation and destruction is the test that separates the priestess from the practitioner, the healer from the killer. Marie's education had encompassed far more than the manipulation of spiritual forces. Under her grandmother's tutelage, she had learned to read and write in 4 languages, to calculate complex mathematical relationships, to understand the principles of medicine and anatomy, and to navigate the intricate social hierarchies that governed plantation life. Mama Brigitte had understood that knowledge was the only form of wealth that could never be stolen, the only inheritance that would survive the uncertainties of enslaved life. The old woman had also taught Marie the history that white people tried to erase, the stories of African kingdoms whose sophistication had rivaled anything in Europe, the accounts of enslaved people who had used their spiritual knowledge to protect their communities or strike back at their oppressors, and the legends of powerful women who had served as bridges between the human and divine worlds. This education had given Marie a sense of her own worth that no amount of degradation could destroy, but it was not until her 16th birthday that Marie had truly understood the full extent of her grandmother's knowledge and the terrible responsibility that would one day be hers. That night, during a ceremony attended by enslaved people from 3 different plantations, Mama Brigitte had called down Papa Legba, the Louis who controlled the crossroads between the physical and spiritual worlds, and allowed him to possess her aged body. What followed had been Marie's initiation into mysteries that few living people had ever witnessed. Papa Legba, speaking through Mama Brigitte's voice, but with an authority that seemed to emanate from the foundations of creation itself, had revealed to Marie the true nature of her gifts and the destiny that awaited her. She would become a mambo, a high priestess capable of wielding the full power of the African spiritual tradition, but she would also face trials that would test her commitment to justice over revenge, healing over harm. The white man's God teaches forgiveness, Papa Legba had said through Mama Brigitte's lips, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. But the old gods know that some crimes can only be answered with justice. Some wounds can only be healed with blood. You will face a choice, child, between the path of the healer and the path of the avenger. Choose wisely, for the consequences will echo through generations. Marie had received her final training during the years following her grandmother's death in 1820, learning from other practitioners who risked their lives to preserve the old knowledge. She had studied with Marie Laveau, the legendary voodoo queen of New Orleans, during secret trips to the city that had required elaborate deceptions to arrange. From the famous Marie, she had learned the urban applications of rural root work, the ways that spiritual power could be wielded in the complex social environment of Creole New Orleans, but the knowledge that would prove most crucial to her destiny had come from an unexpected source, Père Antoine, a Spanish priest whose official Catholic orthodoxy concealed a deep understanding of the syncretic spiritual practices that flourished throughout Louisiana. The priest, whose own Native American heritage had made him sympathetic to alternative spiritual traditions, had taught Marie to read Latin and had shared with her texts that revealed the common roots of many mystical practices. It was from Père Antoine that Marie had learned about the darkest applications of spiritual power, the workings that could drive men mad, the curses that could destroy bloodlines, the rituals that could call forth spirits of vengeance whose hunger for justice knew no bounds. The priest had shared this knowledge reluctantly, understanding that it might one day be used in ways that would challenge his Christian convictions, but recognizing that enslaved people needed every possible weapon in their struggle for survival and dignity. The Dubois family had always been among the cruelest slave owners in Louisiana, but Evangeline had elevated their sadism to new levels of sophistication. Unlike her husband, who preferred the straightforward brutality of whips and chains, Evangeline had developed psychological tortures that left no visible scars, but could break the human spirit as effectively as any physical punishment. Her favorite victims were enslaved women whose beauty or intelligence threatened her own sense of superiority. These women would find themselves subjected to elaborate humiliations designed to destroy their self-respect and demonstrate their powerlessness. Evangeline would force them to compete for her favor through degrading performances, would dress them in fine clothes only to soil them publicly, or would arrange for them to witness the sale of their children as punishment for imagined slights. Marie had watched these performances with growing rage, understanding that Evangeline's cruelties were not random acts of violence, but carefully calculated assaults on the human dignity of people who had already been stripped of every legal protection. The white woman seemed to take particular pleasure in tormenting enslaved mothers, as if she understood instinctively that the maternal bond represented the most vulnerable point in any woman's psychological armor. The incident that had finally triggered Marie's decision to embrace the darkest aspects of her power had occurred during the Christmas season of 1846, when plantation tradition called for a temporary relaxation of the usual restrictions on enslaved people's behavior. Evangeline had organized what she called an entertainment for visiting relatives from New Orleans, a series of performances by enslaved children designed to demonstrate the natural rhythm and musicality of the African race. Marie's daughter, Celeste, then 14 years old and already showing signs of the beauty that would make her valuable in ways that terrified her mother, had been selected to perform a dance that Evangeline claimed was authentically African, but which was actually a degrading caricature designed to reinforce white stereotypes about black sexuality and primitivism. The girl had been dressed in a costume that revealed far too much of her developing body and forced to gyrate before an audience of white men whose eyes held the unmistakable hunger of predators evaluating prey. Marie had watched from the servants' entrance to the parlor, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails drew blood from her palms, as her daughter was transformed into a sexual object for the entertainment of people who viewed her as less than human. The performance had ended with enthusiastic applause from the white audience and promises that Celeste would be much in demand when she reached proper age for more adult entertainments. That night, Marie had held her weeping daughter and felt something fundamental shift in her relationship with the spiritual forces she had spent her life learning to master. The old gods were patient, but they were not infinitely forgiving. There came a time when justice demanded action, when love required the wielding of power that could destroy as well as heal. The final straw had come 6 months later, when Evangeline had discovered Marie's literacy classes and had responded with the calculated cruelty that defined her character. The sale of Celeste to a New Orleans brothel had not been an impulsive act of anger. It had been a carefully planned punishment, designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on both mother and daughter, while demonstrating Evangeline's absolute power over every aspect of her slaves' lives. Marie had begged Evangeline to reconsider, had offered to accept any punishment upon herself, had even offered to use her spiritual knowledge in service of the white woman's desires, but Evangeline had been unmoved by pleas that she viewed as evidence of successful dominance. Her pale blue eyes had shown no trace of human compassion as she explained that Celeste's fate would serve as an example to other enslaved people who might be tempted to rise above their station. "Your daughter is quite beautiful," Evangeline had said, with the casual tone she might use to discuss the weather. "I'm sure she'll be very popular with the gentlemen in New Orleans. Think of it as an opportunity for her to learn skills that will serve her well throughout her life." The words had been spoken with such casual cruelty that Marie had felt the last restraints on her spiritual power simply evaporate. In that moment, she had made the choice that Papa Legba had warned her about decades earlier, the choice between healing and vengeance, between the path of the Mambo and the path of the destroyer. Over the following weeks, as Marie had begun gathering the components for her great working, she had noticed the first signs that her preliminary preparations were already taking effect. Evangeline had begun experiencing disturbing dreams that left her exhausted and irritable during the day. The woman's perfect complexion had developed a nervous rash that no amount of expensive cosmetics could completely conceal. Her famous charm at social gatherings had given way to sharp-tongued comments that alienated friends and family members. But these were merely the opening notes of a symphony of destruction that would crescendo over the coming months. Marie's curse was designed to work slowly, to give Evangeline time to understand what was happening to her and why. The white woman would watch her own mind crumble like sugar left too long in Louisiana's humid air, would feel her sanity slip away like sand through her fingers, and would understand with perfect clarity that her torment was the price of the torment she had inflicted on others. The spiritual preparation had required months of careful work. Marie had to gather ingredients from specific locations at precisely the right times: graveyard dirt collected at midnight, Spanish moss cut during a thunderstorm, bones from animals that had died violent deaths. She had fasted and purified herself according to ancient protocols, had performed preliminary rituals to gain the attention and cooperation of the spirits she would need to call upon, and had crafted the physical objects that would serve as focal points for supernatural forces. The most powerful component of her working was a doll made from mud, gathered at the crossroads, where 4 plantation roads met, the place where Papa Legba was said to hold court, and where the barriers between worlds were thinnest. Into this doll, Marie had woven hair stolen from Evangeline's brush, threads pulled from the white woman's nightgown. and nail clippings gathered from her dressing room. The doll had been baptized with Marie's own blood and charged with the accumulated rage of every enslaved person who had ever suffered under Evangeline's cruelty. As Marie stood beneath the ancient oak tree on this humid evening, holding the final components of her great working, she could feel the spirits gathering around her, like invisible witnesses to divine justice. The Spanish moss stirred without any wind to move it. The temperature dropped despite the season's heat, and the very air seemed to thicken with supernatural anticipation. Tonight, the old gods would answer her call for justice, and Evangeline Dubois would begin her descent into the madness that awaited all those who presumed to treat human souls as property. The curse that Marie was about to unleash would be patient as the grave itself, but relentless as the tide, slowly washing away everything that made Evangeline's life worth living, until only an empty shell remained. In the distance, lights still blazed in the plantation house windows, where Evangeline sat writing letters, completely unaware that her fate was being sealed by forces she had dismissed as primitive superstition. Soon, very soon, she would learn that some powers were older than her civilization, stronger than her laws, and more enduring than her wealth. The first phase of Marie's vengeance was about to begin. The ancient oak tree seemed to pulse with otherworldly energy as Marie began the ritual that would unleash forces older than Christianity, older than the plantations that scarred Louisiana's landscape, older than the very concept of human bondage itself. The Spanish moss hung motionless in air that had suddenly become thick as honey, while shadows moved independently of their sources, drawn by the spiritual magnetism of a working so powerful it threatened to tear holes in the fabric between worlds. Marie's voice rose in languages that predated written history, her words calling upon spirits whose names had been whispered in African forests before the first European ship had ever touched the continent's shores. The ritual components arranged before her began to glow with an inner light that would have been invisible to most human eyes, but blazed like stars to those who possessed the sight. Bone dust mixed with graveyard soil, Spanish moss braided with hair stolen from her enemy's brush, and at the center of it all, the mud doll that would serve as the vessel for Evangeline Dubois's destruction. Papa Legba, guardian of the crossroads, opener of the ways between worlds, Marie chanted, her voice carrying across the plantation grounds like the whisper of approaching death. I call upon you to witness this working, to lend your power to this justice, to open the gates that will allow the spirits of vengeance to enter the world of the living. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in the space of a heartbeat, and Marie felt the familiar sensation of spiritual presence as Papa Legba manifested in the sacred space she had created. The LWA did not appear visually, that was not his way, but his presence filled the air like the scent of ozone before a lightning strike, electric and dangerous and absolutely undeniable. Through this spiritual gateway, other entities began to pour into the physical world. These were not the benevolent healing spirits that Marie usually worked with, but darker forces whose hunger for justice had been sharpened by centuries of witnessing human cruelty. The Petro-Louais, hot spirits of revolution and revenge, answered her call with an eagerness that made the very ground beneath her feet tremble with supernatural energy. Baron Samedi, master of death and guardian of the graveyard, brought with him the accumulated rage of every enslaved person who had died under the whip. Erzuli Dantor, the fierce mother goddess whose love could manifest as terrible vengeance, carried the pain of every woman who had watched her children sold away from her. Ogun, the warrior spirit of iron and blood, sharpened his spiritual blades on the fury of every man who had been forced to watch his family's destruction without being able to fight back. As these powerful entities gathered around Marie's ritual space, the very air began to shimmer with supernatural heat, and the sound of drumming echoed across the plantation grounds, though no drums were being played by human hands. The spirits themselves were providing the rhythm that would drive Marie's working to its climactic conclusion. 3 miles away, in the elegant master bedroom of the plantation house, Evangeline Dubois jolted awake from dreams that had grown progressively more disturbing over the past weeks. The nightmares were becoming more vivid, more specific, and more impossible to dismiss as simple products of an overactive imagination. Tonight, she had dreamed of rotting hands reaching for her from beneath perfectly manicured lawns, of Spanish moss that wrapped around her throat like hangman's nooses, and of dark-skinned women whose eyes blazed with supernatural fire as they pronounced judgments in languages she didn't recognize but somehow understood. The dreams had been accompanied by physical sensations, that persisted even after waking, the feeling of invisible fingers tracing patterns on her skin, whispered voices that seemed to come from inside her own head, and a growing sense that she was being watched by entities whose attention was both unwanted and inescapable. Her usual remedies, laudanum drops, expensive French perfumes, and the reassuring presence of luxury, had proven ineffective against these supernatural intrusions. Evangeline rose from her silk-sheeted bed and walked to the French doors that opened onto her private balcony, seeking relief in the Louisiana night air. What she saw there made her blood freeze in her veins. In the distance near the slave quarters, an unnatural light was flickering between the trees, and she could swear she heard the sound of chanting, carried on a wind that touched nothing else in the immediate vicinity. The rational part of her mind tried to dismiss what she was seeing as some sort of natural phenomenon. Perhaps fireflies had gathered in unusual numbers. Perhaps the wind was carrying sounds from a greater distance than usual. But a deeper part of her consciousness, a part that her refined education had tried to suppress but never quite eliminated, recognized what she was witnessing as something far more dangerous than any natural occurrence. Back beneath the oak tree, Marie's ritual had reached its crucial phase. The mud doll that bore Evangeline's essence had begun to vibrate with spiritual energy, and cracks were appearing in its surface as if something was trying to break out from within. Marie placed her hands on either side of the doll's head and began the specific incantation that would bind her enemy's fate to the supernatural forces she was unleashing. By the power of the crossroads, by the authority of the ancestors, by the justice of the Eldewa themselves, Marie intoned, her voice growing stronger with each word. I bind Evangeline Marie Dubois to this working. As this doll crumbles, so shall her mind crumble. As these bones turn to dust, so shall her sanity turn to dust. As this Spanish moss withers, so shall her peace wither and die. The moment the words were spoken, Marie felt a tremendous surge of spiritual energy flow through her body and into the ritual components spread before her. The mud doll exploded into fragments that immediately began to smoke and dissolve, while the bones cracked with sounds like gunshots, and the Spanish moss shriveled as if touched by invisible flames. In her bedroom 3 miles away, Evangeline was thrown to her knees by a pain that seemed to originate in the center of her skull and radiate outward through every nerve in her body. The agony was unlike anything she had ever experienced, not the sharp pain of a physical injury, but something deeper and more fundamental, as if the very structure of her consciousness was being systematically dismantled. When the initial wave of pain subsided, Evangeline found that the world around her had changed in subtle but disturbing ways. Colors seemed more vivid but somehow wrong, as if she was seeing them through a filter that revealed hidden spectrums of light. Shadows moved independently of their sources, and she could swear she heard whispered conversations in languages that her mind translated automatically, but which no human throat should have been able to produce. The mirror on her vanity table showed her reflection, but with additions that made her gasp in terror. Standing behind her, visible only in the glass, were figures that her rational mind insisted couldn't be there. Dark-skinned women in white clothing, whose eyes blazed with supernatural fury, their mouths moving in silent accusations that she somehow understood perfectly. You stole our children, the figures seemed to say without speaking aloud. You broke our families. You treated us like animals while claiming to be civilized. Now you will know what we have known, the slow dissolution of everything that makes life worth living. Evangeline spun around, but the bedroom was empty, except for herself and the luxury furnishings that had once provided her with such comfort. When she looked back at the mirror, her own reflection stared back at her, but now her eyes held a wildness that hadn't been there moments before, and her perfectly styled hair showed streaks of premature gray that seemed to be spreading even as she watched. The curse was taking hold with devastating efficiency. Marie's years of preparation, her careful gathering of spiritual allies, and her absolute commitment to justice were combining to create a working of unprecedented power. The supernatural forces she had unleashed were not content with simple revenge. They were systematically unraveling the psychological foundations that allowed Evangeline to function as a coherent personality. Over the following hours, as Marie completed the final phases of her ritual and the spirits gradually withdrew to their own realm, Evangeline experienced the first full manifestation of what would become her permanent condition. Every shadow in her bedroom seemed to harbor watching eyes. Every sound, from the normal settling of the old house to the distant calls of nightbirds, carried hidden messages that filled her with dread. When she tried to call for her personal maid, an enslaved woman named Josephine, who had served the Dubois family for 15 years, her voice emerged as a croak that she barely recognized as her own. The words seemed to echo strangely in the air, and she could swear she heard other voices responding, voices that spoke in the same African languages she had heard in her visions. Josephine arrived within minutes, as she had been trained to do, but her usual deferential demeanor had been replaced by something that Evangeline found deeply unsettling. The enslaved woman's eyes held a knowledge that hadn't been there before, and her movement suggested she was seeing things in the room that Evangeline couldn't perceive. "Are you feeling unwell, madame?" Josephine asked, but there was something in her tone that suggested she already knew the answer to her question. "There are things in my room," Evangeline whispered, her voice shaking with terror. "Shadows that move by themselves, voices speaking in languages I don't know. Can you see them? Can you hear them?" Josephine's expression remained carefully neutral, but Evangeline caught a flash of something that might have been satisfaction in the woman's dark eyes. "I don't see anything unusual, madame. Perhaps you should try to get some rest. Sometimes fatigue can cause unusual perceptions." But Evangeline was beyond rest. The spiritual forces that Marie had unleashed were working around the clock, systematically dismantling the psychological defenses that had allowed the white woman to maintain her sense of superiority and control. Every moment brought new horrors, glimpses of figures that disappeared when she looked directly at them, whispered accusations that seemed to come from inside her own head, and a growing certainty that she was being judged by entities whose authority superseded any earthly law. As dawn approached, painting the Louisiana sky in shades of pink and gold that Evangeline now saw as omens of blood and fire, the full scope of her transformation became clear. The elegant, refined woman who had tormented enslaved families for her own entertainment was gone, replaced by a creature of paranoia and terror, whose grip on reality was slipping away like sand through desperate fingers. Marie, exhausted by the spiritual demands of her great working, but satisfied that justice was finally being served, made her way back to her cabin as the plantation began its daily routine of exploitation and survival. The other enslaved people she passed looked at her with a mixture of fear and admiration, understanding without being told that something momentous had occurred during the night. The overseer, a brutal man named Claude Thibodeau, who had replaced the previous overseer after a convenient accident involving a copperhead snake that appeared in his bed, noticed immediately that something had changed in the quarters. The usual sullen resignation that marked the beginning of each workday had been replaced by an electric tension that made him nervous. The slaves were whispering among themselves more than usual, and their glances toward the big house carried an expectation that he couldn't interpret, but which filled him with unease. It was Josephine who first reported that Madame Dubois was experiencing difficulties that might require medical attention. The enslaved woman described erratic behavior, claims of seeing things that weren't there, and periods of apparent conversation with invisible entities. Her report was delivered with the perfect deference that years of slavery had taught her, but those who knew how to read between the lines understood that she was documenting the early stages of what promised to be a spectacular mental collapse. By noon, the entire plantation was buzzing with whispered conversations about Madame Dubois' condition. Some of the house slaves reported that she had been found wandering the halls in her nightgown, muttering in what sounded like African languages she couldn't possibly know. Others claimed she had been seen arguing with her own reflection in mirrors throughout the house, becoming increasingly agitated when the reflection seemed to respond independently. Marie listened to these reports with the satisfaction of a craftsman, seeing her work produce exactly the intended results. The curse was unfolding precisely as she had designed it, slowly enough to allow Evangeline to understand what was happening to her, but relentlessly enough to prevent any possibility of recovery or escape. The point of no return had been reached and passed. The spiritual forces that Marie had unleashed could not be recalled or redirected. Evangeline Dubois was condemned to watch her own sanity crumble day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute, until nothing remained but a shell that would serve as a living testament to the price of treating human souls as property. As the sun reached its zenith over Belmont Plantation, casting shadows that no longer moved according to natural laws, Marie Laveau-Baptiste stood in her cabin doorway and smiled with the terrible satisfaction of justice finally served. The old gods had answered her call. The spirits of her ancestors had lent their power to her working, and the woman who had stolen her daughter was beginning her descent into the madness that awaited all those who presumed to own human hearts. The climax of her great revenge had arrived, and there would be no mercy, no reprieve, and no escape for the woman who had shown none to others. The transformation of Evangeline Dubois from Louisiana's most feared plantation mistress to a babbling madwoman, consumed in supernatural terror, unfolded over 6 agonizing months that would become legendary throughout the sugar parishes. What had begun as disturbing dreams and subtle hallucinations escalated into a complete psychological collapse so spectacular that doctors from as far away as New York traveled to Belmont Plantation to witness what they could only describe as the most dramatic case of sudden-onset insanity in medical literature. By the end of the first week following Marie's great working, Evangeline had stopped sleeping entirely. The bedroom that had once been her sanctuary of silk and luxury had become a prison haunted by visions that grew more vivid and terrifying with each passing day. She claimed to see enslaved women standing at the foot of her bed, their children clutched in their arms, their eyes blazing with accusations that needed no words to communicate their meaning. "They're taking my babies," Evangeline would scream at servants who saw nothing but empty air. "Can't you see them? They're stealing the children and carrying them away to that terrible place where the dead things dance." The house slaves who had once feared Evangeline's wrath now watched her deterioration with a mixture of pity and satisfaction that they dared not express openly. Josephine, who had served as Evangeline's personal maid for 15 years, found herself in the unprecedented position of caring for a white woman who had become completely dependent on the very people she had once tormented without conscience. "She don't sleep, don't eat, unless you put the food in her hands like she's a child," Josephine reported to the other enslaved people during their brief evening gatherings. "She talks to people who ain't there, argues with her own reflection, and sometimes she speaks in tongues that sound like the old languages Mama Brigitte used to use in her ceremonies." The plantation's daily operations began to collapse as Evangeline's condition worsened. Her husband, Monsieur Philippe Dubois, had been away on extended business in France when the curse took hold, and his letters showed increasing alarm at the reports he was receiving from his overseer and the family physician. The man who had left behind a wife renowned for her beauty, intelligence, and social grace was reading accounts of a woman who had apparently lost her mind so completely that she could no longer perform basic functions without assistance. Dr. Émile Beauregard, the family physician who had been summoned from New Orleans to examine Evangeline, was baffled by symptoms that defied every category of mental illness in his considerable experience. The patient exhibited signs of severe paranoid delusions, but with a specificity and consistency that suggested something more complex than simple madness. She could describe in perfect detail the appearances, clothing, and mannerisms of people she claimed to see, and her conversations with these invisible entities followed logical patterns that indicated a coherent, alternate reality rather than random hallucinations. "She appears to be experiencing some form of systematic possession," Dr. Beauregard wrote in his report to Philippe Dubois. "The patient claims to be in constant communication with entities she identifies as deceased enslaved persons, and her knowledge of their personal histories is far more detailed than any white person should reasonably possess. I am forced to consider the possibility that we are dealing with a phenomenon that exceeds the boundaries of conventional medicine." The doctor's carefully worded suggestion that supernatural forces might be involved sent shockwaves through Louisiana's planter aristocracy. If a woman of Evangeline's social standing could be driven insane by what appeared to be African spiritual practices, then every plantation owner in the state was potentially vulnerable to similar attacks. The implications threatened the very foundations of a society built upon the assumption that white people possessed inherent superiority over their enslaved property. Word of Evangeline's condition spread through the underground networks that connected enslaved communities across Louisiana like wildfire, carrying news of liberation. In slave quarters from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, Marie's name was whispered, with the reverence reserved for legendary figures whose deeds transcended ordinary human capabilities. She had accomplished what no rebellion, no escape, no act of physical resistance had ever achieved. She had driven a white woman completely insane using nothing but the spiritual knowledge that plantation owners dismissed as primitive superstition. But Marie's victory came at a price that grew heavier with each passing day. The tremendous spiritual energy required to maintain such a powerful curse was slowly consuming her physical health. Her hair, once lustrous black, began showing streaks of premature white. Her face, always beautiful despite the hardships of enslaved life, developed lines of exhaustion that made her appear decades older than her 45 years. Most disturbing of all, she began experiencing visions of her own, not the controlled spiritual communication that had always been part of her practice, but chaotic glimpses of futures that filled her with dread. In these visions, Marie saw herself standing before a tribunal of spirits who questioned whether her great working had crossed lines that should not be crossed, even in the service of justice. The Dubois who had aided her curse were beginning to demand payment for their assistance, and the price they sought was nothing less than her own sanity. The same forces that were destroying Evangeline's mind were starting to turn their attention toward the woman who had summoned them. The irony was not lost on Marie, as she felt her own grip on reality beginning to loosen. In seeking justice for the theft of her daughter, she had bound herself to spiritual forces whose hunger for vengeance could not be satisfied with a single victim. The curse she had crafted with such care was developing its own momentum, spreading beyond its intended target to affect everyone who came into contact with its supernatural energy. 3 months after the Great Working, Philippe Dubois returned from France to find his plantation in chaos, and his wife transformed into something that barely resembled the woman he had married. Evangeline greeted his arrival by screaming accusations in languages he didn't recognize, claiming that he had brought the sellers of children with him from across the ocean. Her physical appearance had deteriorated as dramatically as her mental state. Her once perfect complexion was now sallow and marked with strange rashes that formed patterns resembling African ritual scarification. Her elegant posture had been replaced by a nervous crouch that suggested she was perpetually trying to hide from invisible threats. Philippe's attempts to restore order to his household were hampered by the strange atmospheric changes that seemed to pervade the entire plantation. Mirrors throughout the house began showing reflections that didn't match reality, with figures appearing and disappearing according to their own mysterious logic. Unexplained sounds, drumming, chanting, voices speaking in African languages, could be heard throughout the day and night, though no source for these noises could ever be located. The plantation's enslaved population, meanwhile, was experiencing changes of their own. Many reported dreams of deceased relatives who brought messages of hope and promises of eventual liberation. Others claimed to see spirits walking among the living, offering protection from the casual cruelties that had defined their daily existence. Most significantly, the brutal overseer Claude Thibodeau began experiencing his own supernatural harassment. Equipment that worked perfectly for enslaved workers would malfunction in his hands. Horses that were gentle with others would become uncontrollably violent in his presence, and he reported being followed by shadows that seemed to mock his every movement. The social ramifications of Evangeline's condition extended far beyond the boundaries of Bellemont Plantation. Louisiana's planter aristocracy found themselves confronting evidence that their enslaved property possessed forms of power that white society had never acknowledged or understood. The comfortable assumption that African spiritual practices were merely primitive superstitions was being challenged by the undeniable reality of a white woman's systematic destruction through supernatural means. Emergency meetings were held in the parlors of New Orleans' most prominent families, where plantation owners shared increasingly alarming reports of unusual incidents on their own properties. Mirrors that showed things that weren't there, unexplained sounds and voices, equipment failures that seemed to target specific individuals, and most disturbing of all, enslaved people who exhibited a new confidence that suggested they knew something their masters didn't. Dr. Beauregard, whose initial examination of Evangeline had opened the door to supernatural explanations, found himself at the center of a debate that challenged the very foundations of scientific materialism. His detailed documentation of Evangeline's condition, including her apparent ability to communicate with deceased enslaved persons, whose identities he was able to verify through plantation records, provided compelling evidence that consciousness could survive physical death and interact with the living world. We are confronted with phenomena that exceed our current understanding of the natural world, Dr. Beauregard wrote in his final report. The patient demonstrates knowledge that she could not have acquired through conventional means, engages in conversations with entities whose existence can be independently verified, and exhibits symptoms that respond to no known medical treatment. I am forced to conclude that we are dealing with forces that lie beyond the scope of modern science. The good doctor's conclusions sent shockwaves through the medical establishment, but they also provided plantation owners with a convenient explanation for their growing fears. If Evangeline's madness was indeed caused by supernatural forces, then the solution might lie in spiritual rather than medical intervention. A parade of priests, ministers, and self-proclaimed exorcists descended upon Belmont Plantation, each convinced that their particular brand of Christianity could overcome what they saw as demonic influence. But the Christian rituals proved utterly ineffective against forces rooted in spiritual traditions that predated European colonization of the Americas by thousands of years. The priests' attempts at exorcism only seemed to agitate the entities that surrounded Evangeline, leading to violent outbursts that left furniture destroyed and participants fleeing in terror. The minister's prayers were answered by voices that spoke in languages the clergyman didn't recognize but somehow understood, were mocking their presumptions about divine authority. As word of these failures spread throughout Louisiana's religious community, a new understanding began to emerge among those who possessed knowledge of the state's complex spiritual landscape. Père Antoine, the Spanish priest who had secretly taught Marie about the darker applications of spiritual power, recognized the signature of a working far more sophisticated than anything he had previously encountered. "This is not the work of a novice practitioner," he confided to his bishop, in a letter that would later be sealed in church archives. "The woman responsible for this curse possesses knowledge that suggests training at the highest levels of the African spiritual tradition. She has called upon forces that our European Christianity has never encountered, and I fear that our conventional approaches to spiritual warfare are inadequate to address what she has unleashed." Meanwhile, Marie herself was struggling with the escalating demands of maintaining her great working while fighting off its effects on her own psyche. The spirits she had summoned were growing increasingly insistent that she expand the scope of her curse, targeting other plantation owners and their families in a campaign of supernatural vengeance that would spread across the entire South. But Marie understood that such an escalation would ultimately destroy her as surely as it would destroy her enemies. The turning point came during the 6th month after her initial ritual, when Marie received a vision that clarified both the price and the purpose of her actions. In this vision, she saw her daughter Celeste, not as the broken victim Marie had feared she would become, but as a powerful woman who had used her own traumatic experiences to develop the strength needed to survive and eventually thrive. "Mama," the vision Celeste spoke with a voice that carried the authority of the ancestral spirits, "your justice has been served, but your vengeance threatens to consume everything it touches. The white woman's mind is broken beyond repair, and her example will serve as a warning to others who might treat our people with similar cruelty. But if you continue down this path, you will lose yourself to the same darkness that has claimed her." This vision provided Marie with the clarity she needed to begin the complex process of containing the forces she had unleashed. Over the following weeks, she performed a series of rituals designed to redirect the supernatural energy away from wholesale destruction and toward more constructive purposes. The spirits that had been feeding on Evangeline's madness were gradually convinced to withdraw their immediate presence, though the damage they had inflicted would prove permanent and irreversible. Evangeline Dubois lived for another 15 years, but she never recovered her sanity. She spent her remaining years in a private asylum in New Orleans, where she was visited regularly by family members who hoped against hope that she might experience moments of lucidity. Those moments never came. Until the day she died in 1862, Evangeline continued to claim that she was surrounded by the spirits of enslaved people who had come to escort her to a judgment that no earthly court could deliver. Philippe Dubois, financially ruined by his wife's medical expenses and the collapse of plantation operations during her illness, sold Belmont in 1850 and moved to France, where he spent his remaining years telling anyone who would listen about the supernatural forces that had destroyed his family. His accounts were generally dismissed as the ravings of a man broken by personal tragedy, but they contributed to a growing body of literature documenting the spiritual resistance that enslaved people had waged against their oppressors. Marie Laveau-Baptiste lived until 1878, but she never performed another major working like the curse that had destroyed Evangeline Dubois. The experience had taught her that some forms of power were too dangerous to wield, even in the service of justice. Instead, she dedicated her remaining years to healing work and to training a new generation of practitioners who would carry the old knowledge into the post-slavery era. Her reputation as the woman who had driven a white plantation mistress insane through spiritual means alone made her a legendary figure throughout Louisiana and beyond. During the Civil War, Union officers actively sought her out, hoping to harness her abilities for military purposes. During Reconstruction, politicians courted her influence among Louisiana's freed population, but Marie remained focused on the work of healing rather than harming, understanding that the true victory lay not in destroying individual oppressors, but in preserving the spiritual traditions that would help her people survive and thrive in freedom. The story of Marie Laveau Baptiste and her curse against Evangeline Dubois became one of the most enduring legends in Louisiana folklore, passed down through generations as both a cautionary tale about the dangers of crossing those who possessed spiritual power and an inspiring example of justice, served against seemingly impossible odds. Modern practitioners of Hoodoo and related traditions still invoke Marie's name when seeking protection against oppression, and her grave in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 remains one of New Orleans' most visited spiritual sites. The story of Marie Baptiste reminds us that resistance takes many forms, and that the most powerful weapons aren't always the most visible ones. If this tale of supernatural justice and spiritual power has moved you, amazed you, or made you think differently about the hidden history of resistance in America, let me know in the comments below. Share this video with others who appreciate stories of courage in the face of impossible odds, and don't forget to subscribe for more forgotten tales of the extraordinary people who shaped our history in ways that textbooks rarely record.